Our BNR update is looming, and I've already talked about what I think should happen in that specific BNR on the Eternal Glory podcast. Check that out if you want my thoughts on this specific bandwave. Instead, what I'm going to do today is talk about what it means for a Magic format to be good, because there's three things that I personally am looking for as an indicator of format health, and I wanted to put that all on the line today. So here we go. Buckle up, it's lecture day. Hello folks, Phil Gallagher, aka ThrabenU here for another Legacy video, although this one is not gameplay. This one is more Magic theory, format health, that sort of stuff. So first off, why am I making this video? Well, essentially, a lot of people are being really crappy to each other right now in regards to Legacy BNR updates. There is a lot of name calling. There is a lot of "you're an idiot" type comments. How could you think that? Oh, you're saying these things could be banned. Oh, why didn't you do X, Y, and Z instead? How could you possibly think this thing? And so I thought it would be useful to have something that I can send to people like that and say, this is why I think this format is unhealthy. This is what I am looking for in a good format. Because, and let's get into some academic terminology for a second, there's this thing called structuralism. And a lot of times, to define something, it is very useful to say, this thing is not that thing. This thing does not fit inside of the box, therefore it is in a different category. And if you want to see what an unhealthy format looks like, it might be really useful to have some terminology to talk about what a healthy format does look like. And so that's kind of what I want to tackle today. And so that I don't have to interrupt my it's not a rant. This is very planned and somewhat scripted. But so that I don't have to interrupt my train of thought later, let me just say now that if you are looking for some Magic cards, TOAMagic.com is the place to shop. Promo code ThrabenU is going to save you 5% on your order every time, and you're always going to get free shipping. I've got a Kefka with my name on it waiting for me in Vegas. And if you want to see any of the deck lists that I am currently messing around with, please check out Moxfield.com. My Moxfield profile will be linked in this video, and a direct link to every single deck list that I ever play will be available in every video description. They're the best. I love them. I have hundreds, if not over 1,000 deck lists on there. The site is awesome. Please consider using that. And with that, let's go ahead and get into the meat and bones of today's content. All right. The number one thing that I am looking for in a Magic the Gathering format is agency. That is, do my decisions matter? Since I'm a language teacher, let's do some etymology real quick. So the word agency comes from ago, which is a Latin verb that means to do. So when I'm talking about agency, I mean, can you do something? And if your decisions don't matter, why are you playing the format? And this is a really key one for me. And we'll start with a current BNR target. Let's be real. Let's start by talking about current Oops All spells. Most of this video is not going to reference cards in this specific bandwave, but I think this is a great way to talk about agency. Your agency does not matter when you play against Oops All spells. For the most part, every decision is in the hands of your opponent. And your win or lose, let me rephrase that. Very few of the decisions that you make influence whether or not you win or lose. So, for example, in game one, you can keep an incredibly viable hand versus just a massive swath of decks. And then your opponent goes off on turn one with Pact of Negation backup. I don't think you can reasonably be expected to mulligan in game one in the dark to something that combos off something that beats something that combos off on turn 1 with protection, right? And if a deck can hyper consistently do that, that is problematic because your agency does not matter. In game 1, maybe if you're on the play and you have force of will and you have days, you stop that first attempt at going off. Otherwise, you just lose the game. And some people have likened this to a slot machine experience where, you pull the lever on your opening hand and the matchup is already decided. That does not feel good. You have no time to sculpt the game, and your decisions did not matter. Agency is usually threatened the most when something wins or effectively wins the game incredibly quickly. And note here that there is a difference between things that reduce your agency and things that eliminate your agency. I am a big fan of Stacks gameplay. Stacks gameplay inherently reduces your opponent's agency, but it does not eliminate it. Also, Stacks pieces don't win the game by themselves. You have to build your deck around them, which often involves putting a lot of really bad cards into your deck. Stacks-based decks often are filling their decks with Lotus Petals and Chrome Mox and Spirit Guides and Soul Lands that maybe don't win the game on their own. And these decks, for example, are often at, roughly 50% mana, which is a lot more than other decks in Legacy. So these cards don't win the game on the spot, and if you have heard me evaluating opening hands with like Chalice of the Voids and Blood Moons, most of the time it's me going, this doesn't really win the game on its own. I don't know if I can keep this without a follow-up threat. And there is a very big difference between things that reduce agency that often come with a deck building cost and things that are just too fast or too objectively powerful that in game 1 scenarios leave your opponent with close to zero agency. And in terms of agency, I am often looking for interesting decisions. If Magic's gameplay is good, there should be tough choices, right? I want you to think about like good coverage moments, like when that person is just like in the tank, just absolutely straining their mind, trying to figure out what to do in a really tough spot, trying to figure out how do I puzzle out of this spot. Those are the spots that I want to be in. I want to have those moments where I can post a screenshot online and say, what's the play here? And get a thread of 50 comments, everyone disagreeing about what to do, and it takes hours to figure out what the best line is. That's the sort of stuff that I want to be put into. Those are cool moments. That's good gameplay. When you are tanking over whether or not you can take that hit from the creature or whether you need to remove it now, you are being presented with a real choice. You have agency, and your actions are going to have consequences, positive or negative consequences, depending on how the rest of the game lines up, what the draws look like, what the follow-up plays look like. And that's great. But the closer to the beginning of the game, the gameplay is pressed, the less agency you might have. So for example, let's talk about days for a second. There are times when you could play around days, and there are times that you can't play around days. And sometimes that depends on the format, and sometimes that depends on what deck you are playing. But let's go back to another time where the format was unhealthy. Let's think about the Ragavan Nimble Pilferer and Dreadhorde Arcanist era of Legacy. So this was Modern Horizons 2, which ended up being a very, very, very unhealthy time for Legacy. And this was a low agency time period because Ragavan and Dreadhorde Arcanist threatened to not literally, but effectively win the game very quickly. And so in many cases, you were not able to play around days or force of will or whatever in this time period. You did not have time to set up. Because if you take time to set up, your opponent accumulates treasures, they start casting your cards, they start rebuying their cantrips, they start rebuying lightning bolts from the graveyard, eliminating the creatures that you are trying to build up. And it is often the case in Legacy that tempo decks are fine until they get some source of card advantage that puts them over the line, at which point the dazes and force of wills and other free and cheap interaction tend to let the deck snowball out of control quickly. And so while you might be able to, say, wait on answering a Delver of Secrets that is hitting you for 1 to 3 points of damage per turn, you weren't able to wait on answering your Ragavans and your Dreadhorn Arcanists because they threatened to snowball the game quickly. So that meant you didn't have agency. If you had a removal spell, you needed to fire it off and hoped that it resolved. Otherwise, the consequences of not casting that spell were too great. So recapping agency here. Do my decisions matter? And am I being presented with interesting decisions? This is kind of the first thing that I am looking for as an indicator of format health. The second thing that I'm looking for from a healthy format is counterplay. So agency is often within the course of a game or match. Do your decisions matter within the game of Magic the Gathering? And counterplay is the meta level above that. That is, if I, during my deck building process, am attempting to beat a deck, do I have counterplay available? That is, can I reasonably expect to beat the things that I am trying to beat? And the ancient players like myself often go back to the classic SCG circuit, SCG games open cycle of Dredge. For a very long time, Dredge was a deck that, if people were not prepared for it on any given weekend, it would absolutely crush. And then people would go, oh, Dredge is well positioned. I need to play my Graveyard Hate again. And then Dredge would decrease in popularity. And so there was viable counterplay for this deck. Dredge was a deck that would almost always win its game ones, but then could very easily be successfully hated out in post-sideboard games. And so, even though the deck was incredible in game 1 scenarios, if it was regularly losing both games 2 and 3 to targeted hate, then the deck was fine, and no bans needed to be made to adjust it. Nothing needed to be done by someone like Wizards of the Coast, because the metagame was capable of handling it and adapting to it. As far as counterplay goes, you should be expected to update your deck to address the metagame. That is a fundamental portion of Magic the Gathering. You should not expect to be playing the same 75 year in and year out. That's not reasonable. Now, should you be able to play the same general strategy? Yeah, absolutely. But are you going to need to change your removal spells, your sideboard cards for the metagame? Are you going to need to add some new cards? Yeah. Are some of your favorite cards going to get power crept out of your deck? Yes, absolutely. But you should be able to reasonably adapt that deck so that you can beat most things that you are trying to beat. Now, is your Pox deck going to be able to adapt to the metagame and have a positive record versus the most powerful stuff in the format? Maybe not. But that might not be what you're there for, right? You might enjoy the play experience of that deck. But when you take some tier 1 or tier 2 legacy deck, you should be able to adapt that deck to the metagame and expect to do pretty well with it. When adaptation starts failing and when innovation starts failing, that is often the sign that bans and restrictions are needed because the metagame cannot adapt to the cards normally. And going back to like Ragavan and Dreadhorde Arcanist for a second, that was a time where that deck was so low to the ground, so powerful, had multiple sources of card advantage, had mana acceleration. That deck kind of had everything. And that was something that the metagame was not particularly good at adapting to. And accordingly, intervention was needed to get that deck in line. And sometimes it is not a banning that gets things in line, it is actually a full-on rules update. So, a few times in the last couple of years, we have seen rules changes that were effective nerfs to cards. So, Companion as a mechanic got nerfed into oblivion by essentially adding 3 onto the mana cost of the cards. Uh, it used to just be that you could just, for 3 mana, cast your Lurrus every single game without fail, and that was some absurd consistency. And now the cards like Lurrus and Yorion require you to pay 3 to put the card into your hand, which is a massive change. And similarly, we have had a lot of rules updates over the years having to do with the cascade mechanic and double-sided cards and things of that nature because the interactions there were not necessarily as intended or were too strong with how the rules currently existed. And in trying to figure out whether or not some of these things are too strong, you can ask, does counterplay exist for them? That is, do your targeted hate cards or do your targeted changes in your deck actually result in you beating those decks? And I think Underworld Breach is a great example of a time when the targeted hate was not performing. When this combo deck broke out and people were initially trying to figure out like how to beat it, what graveyard hate to play, all that sort of stuff, I would often see someone play a card that was clearly there specifically for Underworld Breach, and the Breach player would just win in response to their card being placed on the stack. And that is a great example of your counterplay not actually being effective. Now, to some extent, some of that is not playing the correct card, and I will fully admit to that. But once the metagame is solved and solved, once you have a better idea of what is going on and what cards you should be playing for the matchup, if you are playing your targeted hate cards and it is simply not enough, when your changes in your deck strategy are not enough to keep down those top decks, is not enough to create a cyclical metagame where things are sometimes good and sometimes bad, that might be the point where intervention is necessary. And the current Reanimator decks, for example, have survived multiple B and R updates, losing things like Grief, losing things like Psychic Frog, and despite everyone knowing that Blue-Black Reanimator is at the top of the format, it is still 20% of the format with north of 55% win rate after multiple B and R updates, and the alarm bells should probably start going off because the counterplay is not working. Counterplay is often threatened when the ability to pivot is incredibly easy and the opportunity cost of pivoting is low. And this is a time where I'm going to use current examples to just make sure this is clear to the audience. Both of the decks that I think are likely to get hit in the next BNR update, Oops All Spells and Blue-Black Reanimator, have an incredibly easy time of pivoting, making 0 changes to their deck list, and the opportunity cost of pivoting is very low. So, for example, you're playing against Oops All Spells. You open on a Leyline of the Void. They don't need to change their overall strategy to address that Leyline. They might have boarded in a couple of cards to deal with it, but if that Leyline of the Void is there, they still have perfectly reasonable gameplay. And those things might range from Goblin Charbelcher to Rotting Regisaur to just casting a bunch of Poxwalkers and beating you down. If you stop their primary game plan and the secondary game plan is just free, or even for that deck, often the tertiary game plan is free, then your counterplay was not successful. Versus Blue-Black Reanimator. If you open on a Leyline of the Void, they will Thoughtseize you, reanimate your creature. They will play a perfectly reasonable tempo game plan with things like Tameo and Barrow-Goyf and just move on without missing a beat. Now let's compare this to the Dredge scenario. You open up on Leyline of the Void versus Dredge and they go, shit, my deck doesn't work. I need to answer that thing before my gameplay can go on. Counterplay is effective versus something like Dredge. whereas a lot of counterplay is not currently effective versus top decks because it is so free to pivot once things have gone wrong. And decks should be able to pivot. I don't want to send the wrong message here. When you get Blood Moon, when you eat a Chalice of the Void, when you eat a Leyline, when you eat a scary Planeswalker, you should be able to go, okay, this is bad. I have outs to this. I need to find them. And it's less good when it's, okay, that terrible hate card is here. I'll ignore it and just play a different game at very low opportunity cost. So summing up counterplay here, when you are trying to beat a deck, can you reasonably do so? And when you are targeting those decks, do your hate cards actually perform, or can they be ignored? Let's move on to the next one. And the final big thing that I want to talk about is viability. That is the spectrum of play open? Is there a wide range of decks that you can reasonably select? And note here, I think a lot of people who are very tournament-minded approach viability poorly for the majority of the legacy player base. I think there are a lot of people who enjoy, grinding and playing at the highest level that will go, hey, there's 4 or 5 viable decks. This is a healthy metagame. Whereas when we think about the average legacy player maybe has a deck or two that they have access to. That, you buy into Legacy, and it is an expensive format to buy into. I think it is okay for a Legacy player to be, expected to update their deck to the metagame, but when their deck is completely invalidated by something new that releases, that's, financially speaking, very tough. So even if their decks aren't the best, I would like to see most people who have bought into Legacy with a reasonable Legacy-powered level deck be able to play those decks and not be absolutely embarrassed to show up to a tournament with their deck. And there are kind of some tests and mental heuristics that I have for thinking about whether or not a format is healthy in this regard. And the first is, can you play a fair, non-blue creature deck without being embarrassed? This is mentally what I think of as the Knight of the Reliquary test. Would you be embarrassed to tap out for a fair white or green creature in the current format? And if the answer to that question is yes, that is often a scary sign of format health. So, for example, in the current format, as far as like fair non-blue creature-based decks that are like expecting to win by turning creatures sideways in combat, Death and Taxes is the most popular deck that fits that category, and it is the 15th most popular deck in the format. I think at a little less than 4% of the format right now. And most of those fair creature-oriented decks are just gone from the format. And so that means that a major part of the format is just gone. A non-blue deck that just intends to attack via creatures tends to be a pretty easy entry point to Legacy as far as budget goes. Think about how many people you know that just have a D&T deck or a Maverick deck that they lend out to new players. If that portion of the metagame is just fully gone, it becomes very difficult to just use those cards. And you might have noticed a trend in many of my videos when I am asked to play a fair creature-oriented deck, I am trying to shove the curve of that deck as close to 1 and 2 as I possibly can, because playing things that cost more than 1 or 2 in current Legacy is very, very scary for the most part, because you have things like Oops All Spells and Reanimator that are threatening to end the game on turn 1 or turn 2, and you have to respect that. And it is not as if only one area of the metagame can be invalidated. And this is a time where a picture is worth 1,000 words. So here's an MTG Goldfish snippet here. Let's look at the top cards in the format. That's a deck. Okay, let's look at the top creatures in the format. minus Simian Spirit Guide that snuck in there. That's a deck. Top lands, top spells. Generally speaking, minus a couple of outliers at the outside edge, the top cards overall, top creatures, top spells, top lands, are all coming from the exact same deck. And when you start seeing things like this, it starts tripping the alarm bells of viability. Legacy over, I don't know exactly how long it has been, maybe the last year and a half, has been in a wave of combo dominance, where combo for a very long time has been north of 50% of the metagame, and control in particular is really suffering. We're talking maybe somewhere just a little north of 10% control for the format. And if our fair creature decks aren't super viable and our control decks aren't super viable, then that means that the legacy play experience has essentially zeroed in on the Days Force of Will blue-black decks for the most part, or things that very specifically can keep up with them. And that's a relatively small pool of decks as of right now. The Tempo Reanimator plan has proven sort of overwhelming for the format, and you also just have to respect at any given time dying on turn 1 to backup. And the control decks aren't getting time to set up, the fair creature decks don't have time to deploy their threats, and so Legacy is being compressed to a small range of decks where the counterplay may or may not be working, and where your agency in many games is low. See what I did there, combining all three of my points from today? Like I planned this out or something. And just so that I don't make it seem like this is, very much anchored in this current time, let's go back to other times where this exact same thing has happened. Let's go to Modern Horizons 1 for a minute and talk about Arkham's Astrolabe. This was a card that kind of quietly broke Legacy, and I think it took us a little while to notice exactly how insane this card was. A critical part of the Legacy experience is, I suppose, again, the mana base. Legacy is the format where you get to play with your duels and your fetch lands. You get to play with very powerful mana, and there are insanely good utility lands in Legacy, ranging from Wasteland to Tabernacle, and there are very powerful land-based strategies that you can do. You can go crazy with Field of the Dead. Urza's Saga is very, very strong. Dark Depths represents a very fast combo kill. And so counterplay against lands is a critical part of the format. And building your mana base often involved making choices about how many colors you played, because the greedier you got with your mana base, the more Wasteland would punish you. Well then, Arkham's Astrolabe walked in and eliminated one of the angles of counterplay within the format. And the Wasteland decks no longer got to disrupt the 4 and 5 color control decks. And that led to a period of control dominance. And we saw similar things before with Deathrite Shaman. I'm not going to rehash the comparisons between those. I've got plenty of podcast episodes that do that. And so Astrolabe was making it so that the Wasteland decks weren't particularly good against control. And it was also invalidating a lot of the Blood Moon-based strategy, the Stompy strategies of the time as well. If those decks are playing 4 to 8 Blood Moon effects as a major portion of their deck, and this just gets to say, hey, that thing your deck is built around just doesn't work for 1 mana. Also, it draws a card. Also, I can blink it or turn it into something else later. That's a very, very large advantage. And this existed alongside Throne of Eldraine's Oko, Thief of Crowns. This card invalidated such a massive range of decks just all by itself. The middle ability, target artifact or creature loses all abilities and becomes a green elk creature with base power and toughness 3/3, just said, whatever cool thing you are tapping out for or accelerating out, I just nope it. And a planeswalker that came in at 5 to 6 loyalty threatened to steal a good thing that you did, or otherwise turn very problematic things, ranging from stacks pieces to creatures, into elks that could just easily be chump blocked or ignored, was pretty nuts. And this was a card that maybe didn't look all that good at first glance. And then once you saw it in gameplay, especially if it was accelerated out and it just like came down on turn 2, it was very nutty. And when your chalices became elks, your trinispheres became elks, your ensnaring bridges became elks, your batter skulls, your stone forges, your insert name of threat here became elks just absolutely all the time. The range of decks that were viable shrunk dramatically. And the spectrum of play was just not available because so many things could not compete with this. And one of my tests for format health is like, can you play a fair non-blue creature deck without being embarrassed? And in this world, the answer was no, absolutely not, because every single thing that I do can just be elked. And the specific cards that I'm bringing to the table to fight against Oko may or may not matter, because those two can simply become elks. And so sometimes a singular card or a singular deck might just erase massive portions of potential decks from the metagame. All right, let's move into the tail leg of this here. And now I want to talk about nostalgia. Let's do the etymology thing one more time. Ancient Greek this time. Nostos means a journey home. So think Odysseus, right? Journey home sometimes can be tough. The algia root at the tail end of this means pain. So nostalgia is literally the pain of going home, the pain of a journey home. We as legacy players are often nostalgic of previous formats that we think were good for one reason or another. Maybe a deck we liked was good. Maybe there was a really cool sort of period of time where there was a great cyclical metagame cycle that was repeating, that was very, very healthy. Or maybe we just really liked Legacy at the time when we entered Legacy. And we think back to those golden years of how it used to be and how great it was. And we want that back. Well, Legacy is a format that I think needs to change. If Legacy wasn't changing, it would be boring because it would be solved, right? There would just be a couple of decks that were highly viable at the top of the metagame, and things would never be changing. And so it is the injection of new cards into Legacy that keeps Legacy interesting. And so I think it is important to remember that you should be expecting to update your decks. You should be expecting new powerful things to come in and shake up the metagame. And you need to adapt to those new powerful things. Every single strategy, every single card doesn't get to be viable forever. But something in the general wheelhouse of your deck, the general skill set of your deck, probably should continue to be viable. And note that many times when we think favorably of older formats, we are ignoring the things that were bad about those formats. So, for example, I did a lot of competitive Legacy play around the time of Sensei's Divining Top Miracles. I enjoyed that a lot. I thought that was a fun format. But I think there were also a lot of terrible things about that format. There were a ton of dead games where you sat there largely locked out by a Sensei's Divining Top and a counterbalance, and the game was over, but it was going to take another 20 minutes for the game to physically end. And I know that there were a lot, and I mean a lot of times where every single person in the entire tournament room was waiting on one or two Miracles players to finish their matches. And I would look at a round clock that is 30 minutes over the time for that round and go, like, what are we doing here? I'm not really someone who yearns for any old state of Legacy. And I try to actively discourage people from setting up splinter formats. That is, I want to specifically play Legacy pre-Modern Horizons 1, because I think that takes our very small legacy player base and stops people from playing the actual legacy format as it exists. And I think it is okay to be frustrated with things about the current legacy format. I certainly am frustrated about them, and I have kind of voiced my concerns in a healthy way, and I've said what I would do about format management plenty of different ways. But at the end of the day, as long as legacy exists in a state where you have agency within your games, you have counterplay or the existing metagame, and there's a decently viable range of decks, then I am perfectly okay playing the format as it stands. When one of those things starts breaking down, I might start to have some concerns about format management. When all three of those things are breaking down, that's when we really need some intervention. And I think we are currently in that state, and we'll probably end up in that state again. But here's the hoping that come Monday, we get a BNR shakeup that eliminates many of the concerns that I and other people have for the format. And while there's plenty more that could be said about the BNR cadence or the lightheadedness of the BNR update, I think that is beyond the range of today's video. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. I hope this change of pace from the normal gameplay is appreciated. My plan for next week is to release a BNR reaction video, either Monday or Tuesday, depending on kind of what my schedule allows, and then to return to gameplay content as normal. All right. Have a great rest of the day, folks. See you.